She went through Stour Castle without pausing, and onward to a junction of highways, where she could await a carrier's van that ran to the southwest, for the railways, which encircled this interior tract of country, had never yet struck across it. While waiting, however, there came along a farmer in his spring cart, driving approximately in the direction that she wished to pursue. Though he was a stranger to her, she accepted his offer of a seat beside him, ignoring that its motive was a mere tribute to her countenance. He was going to Weatherbury, and by accompanying him thither, she could walk the remainder of the distance instead of travelling in the van by way of Casterbridge. Tess did not stop at Weatherbury after this long drive, further than to make a slight nondescript meal at noon at a cottage, to which the farmer recommended her. Thence she started on foot, basket in hand, to reach the wide upland of heath dividing this district from the low-lying meads of a farther valley in which the dairy stood that was the aim and end of her day's pilgrimage. Tess had never before visited this part of the country, and yet she felt akin to the landscape. Not so very far to the left of her, she could discern a dark patch in the scenery, which inquiry confirmed her in supposing to be trees, marking the environs of Kingsbere, in the church of which parish the bones of her ancestors, her useless ancestors, lay entombed. She had no admiration for them now. She almost hated them for the dance they had led her. Not a thing of all that had been theirs did she retain but the old seal and spoon. Pooh, I have as much of mother as father in me, she said. All my prettiness comes from her, and she was only a dairymaid. The journey over the intervening uplands and lowlands of Egdon, when she reached them, was more troublesome walk than she had anticipated, the distance being actually but a few miles. In 2 hours, after sundry wrong turnings, she found herself on a summit commanding the long sought-for vale, the valley of the great dairies, the valley in which milk and butter grew to rankness and were produced more profusely, if less delicately, than at her home. The verdant plain, so well watered by the river Var or Froom. It was intrinsically different from the vale of Little Dairies, Blackmore Vale, which, save during her disastrous sojourn at Tantridge, she had exclusively known till now. The world was drawn to a larger pattern here. The enclosures numbered 50 acres instead of 10. The farmsteads were more extended. The groups of cattle formed tribes hereabout. Their only families. These myriads of cows stretching under her eyes from the far east to the far west outnumbered any she had ever seen at one glance before. The green lea was speckled as thickly with them as a canvas by Van Alsloot or Salariette with Burgers. The ripe hue of the red and dun kine absorbed the evening sunlight, which the white-coated animals returned to the eye in rays almost dazzling. Even at the distant elevation on which she stood, the bird's-eye perspective before her was not so luxuriantly beautiful, perhaps, as that other one which she knew so well. Yet it was more cheering. It lacked the intensely blue atmosphere of the rival vale, and its heavy soils and scents. The new air was clear, bracing, ethereal. The river itself, which nourished the grass and cows of these renowned dairies, flowed not like the streams in Blackmore. Those were slow, silent, often turbid, flowing over beds of mud, into which the incautious wader might sink and vanish unawares. its node seemed to lurk a joy. Her face had latterly changed, with changing states of mind continually fluctuating between beauty and ordinariness, according as thoughts were gay or grave. One day she was pink and flawless, another pale and tragical. When she was pink, she was feeling less than when pale. Her more perfect beauty accorded with her less elevated mood, her more perfect mood with her less perfect beauty. It was her best face physically that was now set against the south wind. The irresistible, universal, automatic tendency to find sweet pleasure somewhere which pervades all life, from the meanest to the highest, had at length mastered Tess. Being even now only a young woman of 20, one who was mentally and sentimentally had not finished growing, it was impossible that any event should have left upon her an impression that she was not at least capable of transmutation. And thus her spirits and her thankfulness and her hopes rose higher and higher. She tried several ballads, but found them inadequate, till, recollecting the psalter that her eyes had so often wandered over of a Sunday morning before she had eaten of the tree of knowledge, she chanted, "O ye sun and moon, O ye stars, ye green things upon the earth, ye fowls of the air, beasts and cattle, children of men, bless ye the Lord, praise him and magnify him forever." She suddenly stopped and murmured, "But perhaps I don't quite know the Lord as yet." And probably the half-unconscious rhapsody was a fetishistic utterance in a monolithic falsetto. Women, whose chief companions are the forms and forces of outdoor nature, retain their souls far more of the pagan fantasy of their remote forefathers than of the systemized religion taught the race at later date. However, Tess found at least approximate expression for her feelings in the old Benedict that she had lisped from infancy, and it was enough. Such high contentment with such a slight and initial performance as that of having started towards a means of independent living was a part of the D'Urberville temperament. Tess really wished to walk uprightly, while her father did nothing of the kind, but she resembled him in being content with immediate and small achievements, and in having no mind for laborious effort towards such petty social advancement. She could alone be affected by a family so heavily handicapped as the once powerful D'Urbervilles were now. There was, of course, the energy of her mother's unexpended family, as well as the natural energy of Tess's years, rekindled after the experience which had so overwhelmed her for the time. Let the truth be told, women do, as a rule, live through such humiliations, and regain their spirits, and again look about them with an interested eye. While there's life, there's hope, is a conviction not so entirely unknown to the betrayed, as some amiable theorists would have us believe. Tess D'Urberville, then, in good heart, and full of zest for life, descended the Egerton slopes lower and lower towards the dowry of her pilgrimage. The marked difference in the final particular between the rival vales now showed itself. The secret of Blackmoor was best discovered from the heights around. To read aright the valley before her, it was necessary to descend into its midst. When Tess had accomplished this feat, she found herself to be standing on a carpeted level, which stretched to the east and west, as far as the eye could reach. The river had stolen from the higher tracts and brought in particles to the vale all this horizontal land, and now, exhausted, aged, and attenuated, lay serpentining so far had been to excite the mind of a solitary heroine, which, after descending to the ground not far from her path, stood with neck erect, looking at her. Suddenly, there arose from all parts of the lowland a prolonged and repeated call. Wow, wow, wow. From the farthest east to the farthest west, the cries spread, as if by contagion, accompanied, in some cases, by the barking of a dog. It was not the expression of the valley's consciousness that beautiful Tess had arrived, but the ordinary announcement of milking time. 4:30, when the dairymen set about getting in the cows. The red and white herd nearest at hand, which had been phlegmatically waiting for the call, now trooped towards the steadying in the background, their great bags of milk swinging under them as they walked. Tess followed slowly in their rear and entered the barton by the open gate through which they had entered before her. Long thatched sheds stretched around the enclosure, their slopes encrusted with vivid green moss, and their eaves supported by wooden posts, rubbed to a glossy smoothness by the flanks of infinite cows and calves of bygone years, now passed to an oblivion almost inconceivable in its profundity. Between the posts were ranged the milchers, each exhibiting herself at the present moment to an eye in the rear as a circle on two stalks, down the centre of which a switch moved pendulum-wise, while the sun, lowering itself behind this patient row, threw their shadows accurately inwards upon the wall. Thus it threw shadows of these obscure and unstudied figures every evening with as much care over each contour as if it had been the profile of a court beauty on a palace wall, copied them as diligently as it had copied Olympian shapes on marble facades long ago, or the outline of Alexander, Caesar, and the Pharaohs. They were the less restful cows that were stalled. Those that would stand still of their own free will were milked in the middle of the yard, where many of such better behaved ones stood waiting now. All prime milchers, such as were seldom seen out of this valley, and not always within it, nourished by the succulent feed which the water meads supplied at this prime season of the year. Those of them that were spotted with white reflected the sunshine in dazzling brilliancy, and the polished brass knobs on their horns glittered with something of military display. Their large veined udders hung ponderous as sandbags, the teats sticking out like the legs of a gypsy's crock, and as each animal lingered for busy ones now, and he received her warmly, inquiring for her mother and the rest of the family, though this as a matter of form mainly, for, in reality, he had quite forgotten Mrs. Durbefield's existence, till reminded of the fact by her daughter's letter. "Oh, I know your mother very well," he said, germinatively, "and I heard of her marriage, and an aged woman of 90 that used to live nigh here, but is dead and gone long ago, once told me that the family your mother married into in Blackmore Vale came originally from these parts, and that 'twere an old ancient race that had all but perished off the earth, though the new generations didn't know it. But, Lord, I took no notice of the old woman's ramblings, not I." "Oh, no, it is nothing," said Tess. "Then the talk was of business only. You can milk 'em clean, my maidy. I don't want my cows going askew at this time of year." She reassured him on that point, and he surveyed her up and down. She had been staying indoors since the autumn, and her complexion had grown delicate. "Quite sure he can stand it. 'Tis comfortable enough here for rough folk, but we don't live in a cowcumber frame." She declared that she could stand it, and her zest and willingness seemed to win him over. "Well, I suppose you'll want a dish or two, or victuals of some sort, eh? Not yet. Well, do as you like about it, but faith, if 'twas I should be as dry as a kex with travelling so far." "I'll begin milking now, to get my hands in," said Tess. She drank a little milk as temporary refreshment, to the surprise, indeed slight contempt, of Dairyman Crick, to whose mind it had apparently never occurred that milk was good as a beverage. "Oh, if you can swallow that, be it so," he said indifferently, while holding up the pail that she sipped from. "'Tis what I ain't touched for years, not I. Rot the stuff. It would lie in my innards like lead. You can try your hand upon she," he pursued, nodding to the nearest cow. "Not but what she do milk rather hard. We've hard ones, and we've easy ones, like other folks. However, you'll find out that soon enough." When Tess had changed her bonnet for a hood, and was really on her stool under the cow, and the milk was squirting from her fists into the pail, she appeared to feel that she really had laid a new foundation for her future. The conviction bred serenity. Her pulse slowed, and she was able to look about her. The milkers formed quite a little battalion of men and maids, the men operating on the hard-teated animals, the maids on the kindlier natures. It was a large dairy. There were more than 100 milchers under Crick's management, all told, and of the herd the master dairyman milked 6 or 8 with his own hands, unless away from home. These were the cows that milked hardest of all, for his journey milkmen being more or less casually hired, he would not entrust this half-dozen to their treatment, lest, from indifference, they should not milk them clean, nor to the maids, lest they should fail in the same way for lack of finger grip, with the result that, in course of time, the cows would go askew. That is, dry up. It is not for the loss of the moment that made slack milking so serious, but that with the decline of demand there came decline and ultimately cessation of supply. After Tess had settled down to her cow, there was for a time no talk in the barton, and not a sound interfered with the purr of the milk jets into the numerous pails, except a momentary exclamation to one of the beasts, requesting her to turn round or stand still. The only movements were those of the milkers, hands up and down, and the swing of the cows' tails. such things of war. To be sure, it may be so. I didn't think of it. I've been told that it goes up into their horns at such times, said a dairymaid. Well, as to going up to their horns, replied Dairyman Crick, dubiously, as though even witchcraft might be limited by anatomical possibilities. I couldn't say. I certainly could not. But, as not, cows will keep it back as well as the horned ones. I don't quite agree to it. Do you know that riddle about the not cows, Jonathan? Why do not cows give less milk in a year than horned? I don't, interposed the milkmaid. Why do they? Because there ain't so many of 'em, said the dairyman. Howsomever, these gamsters do certainly keep back their milk today. Folks, we must flip up a stave or two. That's the only cure for it. Songs were often resorted to in dairies hereabout as an enticement to the cows when they showed signs of withholding their usual yield. And the band of milkers at this request burst into melody, in purely businesslike tones, it is true, and with no great spontaneity. The result, according to their own belief, being a decided improvement during the song's continuance. When they had gone through 14 or 15 verses of a cheerful ballad about a murderer who was afraid to go to bed in the dark because he saw certain brimstone flames around him, one of the male milkers said, I wish singing on the stoop didn't use up so much of a man's wind. You should get your harp, sir. Not but what a fiddle is best. Tess, who had given ear to this, thought the words were addressed to the dairyman, but she was wrong. A reply in the shape of why came, as it were, out of the belly of a dun cow in the stalls. It had been spoken by a milker behind the animal who she had not hitherto perceived. Oh yes, there's nothing like a fiddle, said the dairyman, though I do think that bulls are moved by a tune more than cows. At least that's my experience. Once there was an old aged man over at Mellstock, William Dewey by name, one of the family that used to do a good deal of business as tranters over there, Jonathan. Do you mind? I know the man by sight as well as I know my own brother, in a manner of speaking. Well, this man was coming home along from a wedding where he had been playing his fiddle one fine moonlight night, and, for shortness' sake, he took a cut across 40 acres, a field lying that way, where a bull was out to grass. The bull seed William, and took after him, horns a-crowned, big ad, and, though William runned his best, he hadn't much drink in him, considering 'twas a wedding, and the folks well off. He found he'd never reach the fence, and get over in time to save himself. Well, as a last thought, he pulled out his fiddle, and he runned, and struck up a jig, turning to the bull, and backing towards the corner. The bull softened down, and stood still, looking hard at William Dewey, who fiddled on, till a sort of a smile stole over the bull's face. But no sooner did William stop his playing, and turn to get over the hedge, than the bull would stop his smiling, and lower his horns to the seat of William's breeches. Well, William had to turn about and play on, willy-nilly, and it was only 3 o'clock in the world, and a node that nobody would come that way for hours, and he so leery and tired that I didn't know what to do. When he'd scraped till about 4 o'clock, he felt that he verily would have to give over soon, and he said to himself, "There's only this last tune between me and eternal welfare. Heaven save me, or I'm a done man." Well, then he called to mind how he'd seen the cattle kneel o' Christmas Eves in the dead of the night. It was formation was discernible. He had remained under the cow long enough to have milked 3, uttering a private ejaculation now and then as if he could not get on. "Take it gentle, sir, take it gentle," said the dairyman. "'Tis knack, not strength, that does it." "So I find," said the other, standing up at last and stretching his arms. "I think I have finished her. However, though she made my fingers ache." Tess could then see him at full length. He wore the ordinary white pinner and leather leggings of a dairy farmer when milking, and his boots were clogged with the mulch of the yard. But this was all his local livery. Beneath it was something educated, reserved, subtle, sad, differing. But the details of his aspect were temporarily thrust aside by the discovery that he was one whom she had seen before. Such vicissitudes had Tess passed through since that time that, for a moment, she could not remember where she had met him, and then it flashed upon her that he was the pedestrian who had joined in the club dance at Marlow. The passing stranger who had come, she knew not whence, had danced with others, but not with her, had slightingly left her and gone on his way with his friends. The flood of memories brought back by this revival of an incident anterior to her troubles produced a momentary dismay lest, recognizing her also, he should by some means discover her story. But it passed away when she found no sign of remembrance in him. She saw by degrees that, since their first and only encounter, his mobile face had grown more thoughtful, and had acquired a young man's shapely moustache and beard. The latter of the palest straw colour, where it began upon his cheeks, and deepening to a warm brown farther from its root. Under his linen milking pinner, he wore a dark velveteen jacket, cord breeches and gaiters, and a starched white shirt. Without the milking gear, nobody could have guessed what he was. He might, with equal probability, have been an eccentric landowner, or a gentlemanly ploughman. That he was but a novice at dairy work, she had realized in a moment, from the time she had spent upon milking of one cow. Meanwhile, many of the milkmaids had said to one another of the newcomer, "How pretty she is," with something of real generosity and admiration, though with a half-hope that the auditors would deny the assertion, which, strictly speaking, they might have done, prettiness being an inexact definition of what struck the eye in Tess. When the milking was finished for the evening, they straggled indoors, where Mrs. Crick, the dairyman's wife, who was too respectable to go out milking herself, and wore a hot stuff gown in warm weather, because the dairymaids wore prints, was giving an eye to the leads and things. Only 2 or 3 of the maids, Tess learned, slept in the dairy house besides herself, most of the helpers going to their homes. She saw nothing at supper time of the superior milker who had commented on the story, and had asked no questions about him, the remainder of the evening being occupied in arranging her place in the bedchamber. It was a larger room over the milk-house, some 30 feet long, the sleeping cots of the other 3 indoor milkmaids being in the same apartment. They were blooming young women, and, except one, rather older than herself. By bedtime, Tess was thoroughly tired, and fell asleep immediately. But one of the girls, who occupied an adjoining bed, was more wakeful than Tess, and would insist upon relating to the latter various particulars of the homestead into which she had just entered. The girl's whispered words mingled with the shades, and, to Tess's drowsy mind, they seemed to be generated by the darkness in which they floated. Mr. Angel Clare, he that is learning milking, and that plays the harp, never says much to us. He is a parson's son, and it is too much taken up wi' his own thoughts to notice girls. He is the dairyman's pupil, learning family, learning farming in all its branches. He has learned sheep farming at another place, and is now mastering dairy work. Yes, he is quite the gentleman born. His father is the Reverend Mr. Clare at Eminster, a good many miles from here. Oh, I have heard of him, said her companion, now awake. A very earnest clergyman, is he not? Yes, that he is. The earnest man in all Wessex, they say. The last of the old low church sort, they tell me, for all about here be what they call high. All his sons, except our Mr. Clare, be made parsons too. Tess had not at this hour the curiosity to ask why the present Mr. Clare was not made a parson like his brethren, and gradually fell asleep again. The words of her informant coming to her along with the smell of the cheeses in the adjoining cheese loft, and the measured dripping of the whey from the rings downstairs. Chapter 18. Angel Clare rises out of the past, not altogether as a distinct figure, but as an appreciative voice, a long regard of fixed, abstracted eyes, and a mobility of mouth, somewhat too small and delicately lined for a man's, though with an unexpected firm close of the lower lip now and then, enough to do away with any suggestion of indecision. Nevertheless, something nebulous, preoccupied, vague in his bearing and regard marked him as one who probably had no very definite aim or concern about his material future. Yet, as a lad, people had said of him that he was one who might do anything if he tried. He was the youngest son of his father, a poor parson at the other end of the county, and had arrived at Tapathy's dairy as a 6 months' pupil, after going the round of some other farms. His object being to acquire a practical skill in the various processes of farming, with a view either to the colonies or the tenure of a home farm, as circumstances might decide. His entry into the ranks of the agriculturists and breeders was a step in the young man's career, which had been anticipated neither by himself nor by others. Mr. Clare once for all, that I should prefer not to take orders. I fear I could not conscientiously do so. I love the church as one loves a parent. I shall always have the warmest affection for her. There is no institution for whose history I have a deeper admiration. But I cannot honestly be ordained her minister, as my brothers are, while she refuses to liberate her mind from an untenable, redemptive theology. It had never occurred to the straightforward and simple-minded vicar that one of his own flesh and blood could come to this. He was stultified, shocked, paralysed, and if Angel were not going to enter the church, what was the use of sending him to Cambridge? The university, as a step to anything but ordination, seemed to this man of fixed ideas, a preface without volume. He was a man not merely religious, but devout, a firm believer, not as the phrase is now loosely construed by theological thimble-riggers in the church and out of it, but in the old and ardent sense of the evangelical school, one who could indeed opine that the eternal and divine did 18 centuries ago in very truth. Angel's father tried argument, persuasion, entreaty. No, father, I cannot underwrite Article 4, leave alone the rest, taking it in a literal and grammatical sense, as required by the Declaration, and, therefore, I can't be a parson in the present state of affairs, said Angel. My whole instinct in matters of religion is towards reconstruction, to quote your favourite epistle to the Hebrews, the removing of those things that are shaken as of things that are made, that those things which cannot be shaken may remain. His father grieved so deeply that it made Angel quite ill to see him. What is the good of your mother and me economizing and stinting ourselves to give you a university education, if it is not to be used for the honour and glory of God? His father repeated. Why, that it may be used for the honour and glory of man, father. Perhaps, if Angel had persevered, he might have gone to Cambridge like his brothers. But the vicar's view of that seat of learning as a stepping stone to orders alone was quite a family tradition, and so rooted was the idea in his mind that perseverance began to appear to the sensitive son akin to an intent to misappropriate a trust and wrong the pious heads of the household, who had been and were, as his father had hinted, compelled to exercise much thrift to carry out this uniform plan of education for the 3 young men. I will do without Cambridge, said Angel at last. I feel that I have no right to go there in the circumstances. The effects of this decisive debate was not long in showing themselves. He spent years and years in desultory studies, undertakings, and meditations. He began to evince considerable indifference to social forms and observances. The material distinctions of rank and wealth he increasingly despised. Even the good old family, to use a favourite phrase of a late local worthy, had no aroma for him, unless there were good new resolutions in its representatives. As a balance to these austerities, when he went to London to see what the world was like, he was carried off his head and nearly entrapped by a woman much older than himself, though luckily he returned not greatly the worse for the experience. Early association with country solitudes had bred in him an unconquerable and almost unreasonable aversion to modern town life, and shut him out from such success as he might have aspired to by entering a mundane profession in the impracticability of the spiritual one. But something had to be done, and having an acquaintance who was starting on a thriving life as a colonial farmer, it occurred to Angel quarter at the dairyman's. His room was an immense attic which ran the whole length of the dairy house. It could only be reached by a ladder from the cheese loft, and had been closed up for a long time till he arrived and selected it as his retreat. Here, Claire had plenty of space, and could often be heard by the dairy folk pacing up and down when the household had gone to rest. A portion was divided off at one end by a curtain, behind which was his bed, the outer part being furnished as a homely sitting room. At first he lived up above entirely, reading a good deal, and strumming upon an old harp which he had bought at a sale. But he soon preferred to read human nature by taking his meals downstairs in the general dining kitchen with the dairyman and his wife, and the maids and men, who altogether formed a lively assembly. For though but few milking hands slept in the house, several joined the family at meals. The longer Claire resided here, the less objection had he to his company, and the more did he like to share quarters with them in common. Much to his surprise, he took, indeed, real delight to their companionship, the conventional farm folk of his imagination, personified by the pitiable dummy known as Hodge, were obliterated after a few days' residence. At close quarters, no Hodge was to be seen. At first, it is true, when Claire's intelligence was fresh from contrasting society, these friends, with whom he now hobnobbed, seemed a little strange. Sitting down as a level member of the dairyman's household seemed, at the outset, an undignified proceeding. The ideas, modes, the surroundings appeared retrogressive and unmeaning, but with living on there day after day, the acute sojourner became conscious of a new aspect in the spectacle. Without any objective change whatever, variety had taken the place of monotonousness. His host and his host's household, his men and his maids, as they became intimately known to Claire, began to differentiate themselves as in a chemical process. The thought of Pascal's was brought home to him, a measure quan, a plus desperate, un trove quil, a plus d'homes originaux, les gens du commun ne trouvent pas de différence entre les hommes. The typical and unvarying Hodge ceased to exist. He had been disintegrated into a number of varied fellow creatures, being of many minds, being infinite in indifference, some happy, many serene, a few depressed. One here and there bright even to genius, some stupid, others wanton, others austere, some mutely Miltonic, some potentially Cromwellian, into men who had private views of each other, as he had of his friends, who could applaud or condemn each other, amuse or sadden themselves by the contemplation of each other's foibles or vices. Men, every one of whom walked in his own individual way the road to dusty death. Unexpectedly, he began to like the outdoor life for its own sake, and for what it brought, apart from its bearing on his own proposed career. Considering his position, he became wonderfully free from the chronic melancholy which is taking hold of the civilized races with the decline of belief in a benevolent power. For the first time of late years, he could read as his musings inclined him, without any eye to cramming for a profession, since the few farming handbooks which he deemed it desirable to master occupied him but little time. He grew away from old associations and saw something new in life and humanity. Secondarily, he made close acquaintance with phenomena which he had before known but darkly. The seasons in their moods, morning and evening, night and noon, in their temperaments, winds in their several dispositions, trees, waters and clouds, shades and silences, ignis fatui, constellations, and the voices of inanimate things. The early mornings were still sufficiently cool to render fire acceptable in the large room wherein they breakfasted, and, by Mrs. Crick's orders, who insisted that he was too genteel to mess at their table, it was Angel Clare's custom to sit in the yawning chimney corner during the meal, his cup and saucer and plate being placed on a hinged bracket at his elbow. The light from the long, wide, mullioned window opposite shone in upon his nook, and assisted by a secondary light of cold blue quality, which shone down the chimney, enabled him to read there easily whenever disposed to do so. Between Clare and the window was the table at which his companions sat, their munching profiles rising sharp against the panes, while the rear was the milk-house door, through which were visible the rectangular leads in rows, full to the brim with the morning's milk. At the farther end, the great churn could be seen revolving, and its slip-slopping heard, the moving power being discernible through the window in the form of a spiritless horse, walking in a circle and driven by a boy. For several days after Tess's arrival, Clare, sitting abstractedly, reading from some book, periodical, or piece of music, just come by post, hardly noticed that she was present at the table. She talked so little, and the other maids talked so much, that the babble did not strike him as possessing a new note, and he was ever in the habit of neglecting the particulars of an outward scene for the general impression. One day, however, when he had been conning one of his music scores, and by force of imagination was hearing the tune in his head, he lapsed into listlessness, and the music sheet rolled to the hearth. He looked at the fire of logs, with its one flame pirouetting on the top in a dying dance after the breakfast cooking and boiling, and it seemed to jig to his inward tune. Also, at the two chimney crooks dangling down from the crossbar, plumed with soot, which quivered to the same melody. Also, the half-empty kettle, whining an accompaniment. The conversation at the table mixed in with his phantasmal orchestra, till he thought, "What a fluty voice one of those maids has. I suppose it is the new one." Clare looked round upon her, seated with the others. She was not looking towards him. Indeed, owing to his long silence, his presence in the room was almost forgotten. "I don't know about ghosts," she was saying, "but I do know that our souls can be made to go outside our bodies when we are alive." The dairyman turned to her with his mouth full, his eyes charged with serious inquiry, and his great knife and fork. Breakfasts were breakfasts here, planted direct on the table, like the beginning of a gallows. "What, really now? And is it so, matey?" he said. A very easy way to feel him go," continued Tess, "is to lie on the grass at night and look straight up at some big, bright star, and by fixing your mind upon it, you will soon find that you are hundreds and hundreds of miles away from your body, which you don't seem to want at all." The dairyman removed his hard gaze from Tess